So tonight we're going to continue our Bible survey where we left off last week in the story of Samson, 1 Samuel chapter 4. And my daughter asked me what I was teaching on tonight. I said, Samson, we're going to finish up Samson. She said, you already did. I said, no, I don't think I did. She said, you talked about his death last week. No. Yeah, you did. Okay, so you remember better than I do what I taught on? And finally she said, well, you mentioned him dying. I said, well, okay, yes, I mentioned that we will talk about his death, but it's not the same as him dying. So if Madeline is right and I'm wrong and I've already taught about Samson's death, just humor me, but I don't think I did. All right, and just pretend you haven't heard it before. You've probably, even if I haven't taught on it, I'm sure you've heard it before. But we're gonna look at the end of Samson's life, not just about Samson. We're going to talk about some things that happened in between last week's stories about him setting the foxes on fire and his death tonight. Really, if you take the stories that we're going to look at tonight, the summary of them is we're talking about defeating the Philistines, ultimately defeating the Philistines. And so we pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 4. Samson is not featured in this story, but it's part of the same time period. There's a battle that takes place in a town called Aphek or Aphek. I really don't know how it's pronounced. There was a battle there, and the Philistines defeated the Israelites. And they defeated them pretty badly. If we look at 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 3, actually it says before that they killed about 4,000 men. They killed about 4,000 Israelites. You come to verse 3 and it says, when the people had come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? And rereading that again, I've read this story numerous times, but reading that again, it struck me for the first time. I've never noticed it before. They said, why has the Lord defeated us? So yes, the Philistines were the ones out there with the swords and the bows and the arrows, but the Israelites, I think, rightly recognized that it was their dealings with God were what decided the battle. I mean, you could say here that they're trying to blame God, because there is a history of Israel trying to blame God for things. Oh, we're thirsty, so God brought us out to the desert to die. They did that all throughout their wanderings in the wilderness. But I think they're right here. I don't think they're just whining and blaming God. Or even if they are, I think they're right in understanding the battle was not determined by the Philistines. The battle was determined by the Lord. And if God wanted Israel to win, they would have won. Because we see numerous times throughout the Old Testament that Israel wins some battles that on paper they should have lost. And they lost a lot of battles that on paper they should have won. And the determining factor was where they stood with God and what God's plan was. So they said here, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? It was not the Philistines who defeated them before the Lord, but the Lord before the Philistines. So they were discouraged by the loss of these 4,000 troops. And so the Israelite elders came together and they said, what we ought to do is get the Ark of the Covenant and have it brought down to the camp and to the battlefield. Because what I picture them doing here, not only having the power of God because of the ark, but I picture this sort of like the closing or the climactic scene of The Patriot. Have any of you seen that movie? See, I assume everybody's seen that movie. Oh my goodness, you need to watch that movie. I love that movie. I'm trying to remember if there are any objectionable parts in it because it's been a while since I've watched it, but I love that movie, and I love at the end, I'm going to spoil it for you, but in case you hadn't heard, we won the Revolutionary War, so it shouldn't come as a tremendous surprise to you. But toward the end, the American militia there in South Carolina is getting whooped up on by the British. And they're starting to retreat. They're not a formal army. They're just kind of a ragtag band of farmers and scoundrels, some of them. And they're turning and retreating. And I believe it's Mel Gibson's character grabs the flag as it's about to be dropped and runs as everybody's in retreat, he runs forward to where they can all see him, and he waves the flag, and it sort of rallies them, and I get goosebumps every time I watch it. It's by golly, it's how we started, and it's how we ought to still be. But they see the flag, and they rally toward that. It boosts their morale, and they turn around, and they end up defeating the British after all. And that's sort of how I see the decision of the Israelite elders to bring the Ark of the Covenant down to the battlefield. They're expecting that if the soldiers see the Ark of the Covenant, that it's going to bolster them, that they're going to fight harder. And so maybe it's a decision that makes sense from that standpoint. But if you look at their question in verse 3, morale was not their problem. Their problem was that they were not where they needed to be with God, and simply bringing the ark like it was some kind of magic charm was not going to fix things between them and God. But in any case, they brought the ark. The troops saw the ark, and they got excited. They shouted, they hooped and hollered, and the Philistines were panicked by this because they said, "What is going on? What is all the shouting about?" Because they didn't camp too far from one another, so they could get up in the morning and just not have far to go, put your shoes on, and go fight a war, right? And so they hear the noise from the Israelite camp. Somehow they get word that the Israelites have the ark, and that caused panic, because they had heard stories about how the God of Israel had dealt with Egypt. If you look at verse 8 here, the Philistines are afraid, and one of the things they say is, "Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods?" These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Now, they understand the power of the God of Israel. They understand what he did to the Egyptians, but they don't really understand who he is still. Because what they're worried about is the physical presence of the ark. They're looking at the ark as the way they look at their gods. If you want to win a battle, carry the statue of whoever with you into battle, and that golden god or that stone god or whoever, it will bless you and help you win the battle. They're looking at the Ark of the Covenant as almost like an idol, like one of their pagan idols. And they're saying these gods that are inhabiting the ark or whatever are going to create problems for us. They're going to strengthen Israel because we've heard about what they've done before. And so at that they said, then we just have to fight harder. If they brought their gods, which is the Ark of the Covenant, but if they brought their gods to the battle, we just have to fight harder to overcome that. So they decided they would, because they didn't want to be enslaved by the Israelites. So they go into battle again. And who do you think wins this time? The Philistines again. The Philistines won again. This time they killed 30,000 Israelites. And even worse, an even greater catastrophe, they captured the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, that would be a devastating loss. For one of your national symbols, something that was so wrapped up in your religion and your identity, to be captured by the enemy. I don't even think we have anything that compares. The closest I can think of to us understanding what this would have been like for the Israelites was 9/11. I mean, just the shock that was to our national psyche. But I think it goes beyond that. I mean, imagine if Al-Qaeda had come and captured the original Declaration of Independence, the original Constitution, the Liberty Bell, George Washington's wooden teeth, I mean, you name it, had taken all these symbols of America and had taken them back with them and was now parading them around as propaganda tools, as signs of their superiority, that might give some idea of how the Israelites would have felt after this. So this was a catastrophe. And the Israelites didn't understand. There was a man from the tribe of Benjamin who escaped, and he went back to Shiloh, which is where Eli was, the high priest. And he carried word back about this battle. The man, when he got there, he looked like he had been in a battle. The Bible describes him as dirty and torn clothes, and he ran into town. And Eli asked him what had happened. Eli was very old by this point. He was 98 years old. He asked what had happened. And the man told him that the Israelite army had taken heavy casualties. They're talking 30,000 dead. I don't know how big the army was at that point, but no matter how big your army is, 30,000 dead in one day is a pretty big deal. I'm wondering, just offhand, I didn't think to look at this beforehand, how many were killed at D-Day. Anybody want to look that up for me real quick? But he came back and he told them about the heavy casualties that they had taken, and he said that on top of that, Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had died in the fighting, and told Eli that the Ark of the Covenant had been captured. Now, do you remember us discussing Hophni and Phinehas previously? Do you remember what the deal was with those two? Why they're important to the story? There was a prophecy from Samuel. You remember God calling out to Samuel, calling him by name, and Eli finally realizing it was God, and Samuel went back and listened. Do you remember what God told Samuel to tell Eli about Hophni and Phinehas? Yes, that's part of it. But he also said that if they both died on the same day, that it was the sign that it was God's judgment that had killed them. You remember? Now, as I'm saying that, I want to double check that I'm not remembering incorrectly. It's in chapter 3. Well, maybe I'm not seeing it now.
Sarah and his sons are blessed for me, God, and he did not restrain them.
Yes, I see that, but I could have sworn it said. Oh, here we go. It's in chapter 2, prophecy against Eli's household. Chapter 2, 34. Now this shall be a sign to you that will come upon your two sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. Okay, so I was confusing a couple of things. It was not Samuel who brought that prophecy, but that was still the prophecy. So, as God said, Hophni and Phinehas both died in the same day, and it was confirmation from God that it was His judgment on them. Did anybody find the number on D-Day? Yes, sir.
They said there's no official count, but they think about 2,500 Americans died.
Okay.
About 1,500 allies.
What Google said was 4414.
Okay.
Allied troops.
Okay. So we're looking at about 9 times as many people died at this battle than died at D-Day. That's a pretty substantial loss, especially considering how big our forces were going in. So this would have been a shock. And the shock from this news was so severe that Eli just couldn't take it. He fell backwards out of his chair. And at 98, you've got to be careful about things like a fall. He fell out of the chair, and he broke his neck, and he died from the fall. What's that? He was old and heavy. I missed that word. I missed that word. I missed that he was heavy. All right. I guess that makes your neck more fragile, maybe. You fall harder. There you go. And he may have been sitting up on some kind of raised platform type thing. We don't know how far he
Sounded
fell.
like he died when he heard about the ark.
Could be,
He
yeah.
told about the death first, and then he said when he heard about the ark, he told about
Yes. So there was just a lot to take in, and the shock of all of it. Now the shock of the news, it didn't stop. It didn't stop causing problems there. Phinehas's wife was pregnant, and the shock made her go into premature labor, and she actually died from the complications. And while she was dying, she ended up naming her son Ichabod, which is a name that meant the glory of the Lord had departed from Israel. It says in verses 21 and 22, then she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel because the ark of God has been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. All right. Questions on that story? Or comments? Or things you see in your notes that might add to our understanding of it?
I have written in my Bible where it talks about I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a prediction of Jesus
Mm-hmm.
coming, which is, I don't know where I put that.
That makes sense in the wording. I mean, what we see with a lot of the Old Testament prophecies is they have a short-term fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment. And I think Israel, until the coming of Christ, would have understood that as talking about Samuel. But Samuel's not there forever. And so, yeah, I think that absolutely would fit Jesus. And Hebrews spends a lot of time talking about him as the high priest. So that's good. I hadn't thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense that he would be talking about Jesus there. Why do you think God would allow the ark to be captured?
They took it out there when they shouldn't.
Okay, took it out there where they shouldn't have.
I think they're relying more on the ark than they were on God.
Okay, kind of treating it like a lucky rabbit's foot. Yeah, and when I said it made sense from a standpoint of rallying the people, sometimes things make sense, but they're still wrong. So that became a problem for Israel a lot of times, that there were things that God gave them that they misused. If you recall the story of the bronze serpent that Moses made, eventually by the time of the days of King Hezekiah, they ended up worshiping that as an idol. And it had to be destroyed. And so sometimes the things that even God gave them, like the Ark of the Covenant, they began to misunderstand and think they were powerful in and of themselves, and instead of focusing on the Lord.
Showing how important it was, because nobody that had it prospered. I mean, it caused some really bad things to happen to people that took control of it.
Yes.
So there was a blessing on it.
Yes. And that's where we're coming next, is the things that happen. And if you saw the documentary film about how the Nazis got hold of the Ark of the Covenant, with Indiana Jones in it, you remember that documentary? I was making a joke, and then I realized, wait a minute, they probably think I'm into some conspiracy theory nonsense when I said the Nazis got a hold of it. Now that was a joke. I tell the kids that all the time. Like, do you remember that documentary about the two sisters, and the one made it winter all the time? You know, Frozen. That's just a running joke at home. And then I realized y'all thought I was serious. So, which it doesn't help that the History Channel talks about so many things that did not happen in history and makes documentaries about them. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah. So if you remember. If you remember that documentary about Indiana Jones, yes, bad things happen when you get hold of the ark and misuse it. But on to some things that really happened with the ark. We're going to go next to 1 Samuel chapter 5. The Philistines holding on to the ark, and they didn't keep it for very long. They were excited about their prize at first. It says they took the ark of God and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. When the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up by Dagon. And Dagon was one of their gods. He was, my notes say he was originally an agricultural or storm god, but the Philistines actually made him head of their pantheon. Now what that means is, if you think of, probably the closest we come to understanding this is the Greeks had all their many gods that they worshipped or they dealt with, and Zeus was king of the gods. He was the most powerful, he was the most important. So for them, that was who Dagon was. He was their chief god. They took the Ark of the Covenant, they brought it as a spoil of war, as like a trophy, back to the temple, and they put it in the temple of Dagon, or Dagon. And when it says they put it right next to the statue of Dagon, that what they were doing there was showing Dagon's superiority over the God of Israel. Hey, look, we have his ark and we're putting it in our temple before the statue of Dagon to let you know that Dagon is more powerful than the God of Israel. That was their plan. That's what they thought was going to happen. But they locked up their building at night. They went home. They came back the next morning and they found that the statue of Dagon had fallen over and was actually prostrate before. I wanted to make sure I didn't say the wrong word. It was lying prostrate before the ark of God. It was laying on its face before the ark, almost as though it were worshiping toward the ark. And the Philistines thought, well, that's curious. I wonder how that happened. They took the statue, they set it back up, they went about all their little rituals and things that they did. End of the day, they lock up their building, they head home. I don't know that they literally locked it up. I'm just thinking what we would do. But they got everything ready and they went home. They came back the next day and they found their statue, not only that it had fallen again where it was bowing toward the ark, but they discovered that its hands and its head had broken off. What is the symbolism of the head and hand? Now, when I say symbolism, I believe it actually happened. But I believe there's a reason God broke off the hands and the head of the statue. What would be the symbolism that the Philistines would understand about that? If Dagon suddenly has no head and no hands. Huh? A cross? Okay. Bingo. Say it louder. He's useless. He's powerless. He has no hands. He has no head. And God was illustrating the reality about Dagon. That here they were worshiping this statue that they credited for their victory, and yet it can't think, it can't will things, just as if their God were actually headless. He can't do anything, he can't help them, as if he were actually handless. So God was illustrating the uselessness of Dagon. He was using the statue to put a physical picture in front of them of what the spiritual truth was. And so the Philistines understood it. They took this they realized Dagon is powerless before the God of Israel, and they panicked about it. So much so, even more when the people of Ashdod, where the temple was, where the statue was, where they had taken the ark, the people of the community began to break out in tumors. And one of the notes I ran across this week suggested it might have been something along the lines of bubonic plague. Tumors. My assumption here is that the Hebrew word just indicates a big something that came up on a person and not necessarily like a cancerous tumor. If that's the case, then it could be bubonic plague. One of the truthful documentaries on the History Channel talked about how people would develop big, I can't even think of the word now, but like knots, huh? Boils, yes, boils, that's the word. And so it could have been something like that. Or it could have been something special that God invented just for this instance. We don't know. But somebody suggested God could have sent bubonic plague to the people of Ashdod. So they decided, you know what, maybe it's a good idea if we get rid of this thing. So let's pack it up and let's send it down to Gath. Let's just send it to our neighbors in the next Philistine town. By the way, Gath is where Goliath comes from later on. So Gath was a Philistine town for a long time. They sent it to Gath, and the people said, sure, we'll take your ark. What a lovely trophy. And then they started to break out in the same kind of tumors. So they thought, maybe we need to get rid of the ark. And they packed it up and sent it to the city of Ekron nearby. But the people of Ekron said, no, thank you. Get that thing out of here. We have already heard what happened at Ashdod. We've heard what happened at Gath. And we don't want Ekron to be added to the list. By the way, some manuscripts, depending on which Old Testament manuscripts you're looking at, say that in addition to the tumors, that there was a plague of mice. Now that becomes important later on when you hear their response. And by the way, that might be why some people think it was bubonic plague, because they believe that the virus that spreads the plague was spread by the bites of the fleas that bite the rats that live in the house that that ate the cat that ate the rat that lived in the house. What anyway? So sorry. The things that pop into my mind. The things that pop into my mind, but Sunday feels too formal to say out loud. So that would make sense if there were mice that then it could be plague too. They wanted no part of it. And so they said, we're going to send, and I said it wasn't a long time, it was really about 7 months. But they didn't hang on to it as long as they had intended to. The people of Ekron sent it immediately back. It was in custody of the Philistines for about 7 months. And they told the Philistine rulers, we want to send this back to the Israelites. We don't want this here. We want to make sure that they take it back, and we're going to send an offering to appease the God of Israel. And so they said, what should we do? They put a gold offering. They put a gold offering of golden tumors and golden mice. And I believe there were 5 of each. They put them together with the ark. They put the ark on a brand new cart that was hitched to 2 brand new milk cows. I believe they were cows that had never been milked. My notes say brand new cows. I'm trying to remember what I meant by that. I don't think they just went down to the cow dealership and bought them. I think they were unmilked cows, if memory serves.
They've never been yoked.
Never been yoked. That's what it was. All right. Thank you. Never been yoked. They had never been hitched up to a cart, so they really kind of didn't know what to do. And the idea was, we're going to put this offering, we're going to put this peace offering on the cart, and we're going to point it toward Israel. And if these cows that don't know what they're supposed to do, being yoked together with this cart, if they go straight back to the Israelite camp, then we will know that the God of Israel has accepted that back, and it was him, he was responsible, and he's accepted it back, and we're good. If they divert and they just kind of wander all over the countryside, then we'll know that it had nothing to do with the ark. And so they hitched up the offering and the ark and everything on the cart with the 2 new cows, and what do you suppose happened? They took off and went straight back to Israel. In chapter 6, it describes how they went into Israelite custody. The cows headed, this is chapter 6, verse 12, then the cows headed straight for the road to Beth Shemesh and went along the highway, lowing as they went, and did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them to the border of Beth Shemesh. So that's evidently the nearest Israelite-controlled town to the front lines. And I'm picturing, they want, here they are covered in tumors or boils, whatever you want to call them. They're inflicted with mice, and they just want this thing gone. And they are following it, I assume, from a safe distance to make sure it gets back. And they want to make sure that thing goes back into Israelite territory and gets away from them. All right, so what can we learn from this story of the Philistines returning the ark?
God wanted it back.
Say that again?
God wanted it took back and he guided the animals.
God wanted it back and he guided the animals. Yeah. The Philistines got their sign to know that it was God being involved.
Mine said that there were two milk calves and they had taken their milk cows and they had taken their calves off of them.
Mm.
So they weren't happy cows.
Oh, that's true.
But they went.
Yeah.
Right straight to it.
That probably explains why they lowed the whole way, it says. They were whining and moaning the whole way, but they went because the Lord led them. I think it also answers a question that would probably be raised in our minds if we think about it, a question that I posed to you with the previous story. Why would God allow the ark to be taken? We're going to see all throughout the Old Testament. This may not be even the first time, but I know it's not the last time, where we see another country kind of get the best of Israel to the point where we might wonder, why are they allowed to do this? Why are they allowed to get by with this? And God says, oh, don't worry, I'm using them as the... they are wicked too, but I'm just using them as the instrument of justice toward you right now. Don't worry, I'll dispense. They're not getting away with it. I'll dispense justice to them later. That particularly comes to a head with the book of Habakkuk in dealing with the Babylonians, when Habakkuk says, God, how long are you going to let the Babylonians get by with treating us this way? And God basically says, don't worry, they're going to get theirs too. Okay, so we see over and over God uses these pagan nations as instruments of justice to call his people to repentance, but it doesn't mean they get off scot-free as well. So he allowed the ark to be taken, but then he punished them for taking it. Any questions or comments or things to add from your notes?
I was thinking that God also used, he doesn't allow people to use his name to ridicule.
Right.
And they started ridiculing the ark, and then God did this.
Yeah, that's true. God wasn't going to let himself be dishonored in that way. That's good. Do we have anything from the feed? Not so much. All right. Y'all are just along for the ride, I guess. Just enjoying it. All right. If you're still there, I can't even tell if there's anybody still there. But all right, let's go on to our final story that we're going to look at tonight, and it's in Judges chapter 16. So turn backwards in your Bibles and forward in time, just a few years. This is about 17 years after the battle with the ark. Don't ask me where I came up with the dates. I'd have to get my book out again and look at it, because I've told y'all I write books mainly so I don't have to remember stuff when I come across it in research. Not because I think my insights are brilliant. I just don't want to forget. So, Judges chapter 16, Samson and Delilah. This is probably a familiar story to a lot of you. But Samson's parents, if you recall, they were convinced they weren't going to be able to conceive, and God blessed them with a son. And so they promised to God that he would be a Nazirite. That involved him never drinking alcohol. As a matter of fact, I think he couldn't even touch grapes. He would never eat unclean foods. He would never cut his hair. By the way, unclean, that doesn't mean dirty, like, you go to a street hot dog vendor and you wonder, is it clean or not? It means ceremonially clean. He couldn't eat pork. He couldn't eat certain animals. He couldn't eat them in certain combinations. So he would never eat unclean foods. He would never cut his hair. I believe there was also the requirement they were not supposed to touch dead things either. And God strengthened him while he kept these vows. God, as a matter of fact, was far more gracious to Samson than he deserved, because we've already seen that Samson has some pretty big flaws in the stories we've already looked at. And yet we see these instances where it says the Spirit of God came over him, and then he did these miraculous things. Samson, among his many flaws, we've looked at some stories about him being kind of petty and temperamental and violent on top of it. But one of Samson's fatal flaw was his weakness for loose women. Is that an okay way to say it? Although, by the way, let's not just blame the women. Apparently, Samson was a loose man. So, the story, or the chapter here opens with him going to visit a prostitute and them trying to ambush him while he's visiting the prostitute. After that, he falls in love with Delilah. He meets this woman, and he's smitten by her. And he is too infatuated with her to realize that the feelings are not mutual. Delilah is just using him in the relationship. She gets close to him, and a group of Philistine leaders came to her. It says in Judges 16, verse 5, the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, I've written in my notes that they offered her 1,100 pieces of silver. That's not so. Each of them offered her 1,100 pieces of silver. She was going to be set for life by doing this. But she doesn't even hesitate. She had no genuine affection for Samson. She was just using him. So she asked him, Samson, what is it that causes your strength? And how could we get rid of it? Now, I would like to think that, shouldn't he be smarter than that? I'm trying to think of a nice way to say what I'm trying to say. Are there not just questions that make you suspicious? If she had asked, what's the secret of your strength? I could see somebody wanting to know that. What's your secret at doing this? How'd you get to be so strong? How'd you lose all that weight? How'd you get to be so smart? What's your recipe for whatever? People want to know things like that. And sometimes we'll tell them, or sometimes we'll say, no, that I'm going to take that with me to the grave. But the fact that she asks, how could we get rid of your strength? She says, with what you may be bound to afflict you. What is it that we could do to overcome your strength? Yeah, and he gives an answer, but I'm just baffled by the question. Like if the kids were to ask me in a couple of years, by the way, our house is going to be like sneaking out of East Germany, all right? Between my alarm sensors on everything and Charla's cameras all over the inside and outside of the house, there's no hope. But if the kids were to come and say, what time are you going to bed tonight? I might think they're just making conversation. But if they said, what time are you going to bed tonight? And oh, by the way, have you fixed the alarm sensor on that one window?
Where's the blind spot?
Right. They haven't asked that. But I think alarm bells are going to start going off in my brain. So I'm baffled by this question. But love makes people do strange things. So he decides to... Oh, it gets even dumber. As I'm thinking through this, it gets even dumber. This story might ought to be taught to our youth.
We're thinking of our children
what it reminds me of. Just
Oh.
like trying to talk to a child.
Yeah.
You're just, no.
I'm just thinking the students might need to be taught this, because infatuation will make you do dumb things if you're not careful. But she says, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson tells her, now admittedly, he's cagey at first. He gives her an answer. He's kind of teasing her. Samson said, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So they came, while he's asleep, the Philistine leaders, they came and they tied him up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have never been dried. Strings like what you would use to shoot a bow with. So pretty strong things. They were lying in wait with her in her room, and she calls out, Samson, the Philistines are upon you! He gets up, he breaks the bowstrings. I love the description here in verse 9. He broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So he just snapped them like they were nothing. Like they had no tensile strength left. He just snaps them, and the secret of his strength was not known. Now, I don't know if he discovered the Philistines at that point, but I remember, I think I told you that, I think I mentioned on a Sunday night watching the Bible story videos as a kid, because I was terrified by the voice when the demon said, we are legion. You know, that's still, so even reading it now still kind of sends chills down my spine. I remember watching the video of Samson, and so as I'm telling you this story, I'm picturing this. In each scene, the Philistines come back to Delilah, and they're just a little more beaten up than the last time. You know, they come with bandages, and the next time they're limping in, and the third time they're coming back to Delilah with neck braces. That's kind of how I picture this. You know, like. But he knows she's wrapped him up in bowstrings because she told him that would make him powerless. So Delilah said to Samson, look, you've mocked me and you've told me lies. Tell me with what you may be bound. So he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So she arranges for him to be tied up with brand new ropes while he's asleep. He's tied up. The Philistines are lying in wait. She shouts out, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He wakes up. He stands up and he rips the ropes. It says, broke them off his arms like a thread. Delilah said to Samson, verse 13, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. I don't know why, this is just not rolling off my tongue tonight. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he woke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. And she said to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? If you loved me, you would tell me. Probably some crocodile tears here too. And you have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death. She just nagged me till I was going to die. That he told her all his heart and said to her. This is where I said it's only going to get dumber. Because the last 3 things he told her, the last 3 things that he said to her in confidence about the secret of his strength, she used against him, and now he finally comes and big fat tells her anyway. I don't understand. He told her, no razor, verse 17, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw he had told her all his heart, he'd told her all the truth, she called them back. The Philistines came, they paid her. She lulled him to sleep on her knees. Come rest your head on my lap and just go off to sleep. Everything's going to be all right. And then she called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him. In the Bible videos I watched as a kid, the Philistines tormented him, but this says she started it. and his strength left him. She said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he woke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free, but he did not know the Lord had departed from him. So the Philistines took him into custody. They had an easy time of it. They bound him in shackles. These were metal. And they used him as a grinder. Oh, it also says they gouged out his eyes. And they used him like an animal to run their mill to grind grain down at Gaza. Then one day they took him and put him on display out in front of their temple. And they began to sacrifice to Dagon. And they began to sing songs about how Dagon had delivered Samson into their hands. They began to sing in verse 24, Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. And then they called for Samson to be put out to perform for them. They put him between two of the pillars. They shackled him there. And Samson said, let me touch the supports of the temple so I can tell where I am, so I can lean on them. And it says the temple was full of men and women, the leaders of the Philistines, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, watching Samson perform. And by the way, they're not just mocking Samson. They're not just praising Dagon. They're mocking the God of Israel who gave him the strength. And as they're singing about the glories of Dagon, what they're really doing is making Dagon out to be more powerful than the God of Israel. And Samson, despite all his faults and flaws, was bothered by this. And he says, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And it says there that he took hold of the 2 middle pillars supporting the temple. He braced himself against them, one on his right, the other on his left. Then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were with it, so that the dead that he killed at his death were more than all he had killed in his life. And his family came and got his body and took it back for a proper burial. But he killed 3,000 Philistines that day, more than in his entire life. And it said he had judged Israel for 20 years up to that point. It's a tragic story. It's tragic, the potential that was wasted. It's not just tragic because of the fact that Samson died. It's tragic because of the way God was with him and how he squandered it, how he was so foolish in his stewardship of everything God had given him. And it's one of those stories that I look at and I think, I hope I don't do the same thing. I don't see running around with loose women. But I could very easily be just as foolish in other ways. And I think we all could. And I think that's one of the important things about the story of Samson for us to remember. Not to waste what God has entrusted to us. God has blessed each of us in specific ways so that we can serve Him and so that we can glorify Him. And we need to actually use those for His glory. Do you have questions or comments on that story?
Did they give her the money before this happened?
It sounds like it.
Yeah, I wonder why they did that.
I think, because the way it says she knew that he told her all his heart, I think she was convinced he was telling the truth. In my experience, women have kind of a sixth sense about when they're being lied to. Not with me lying, but she plays lie detector on a daily basis. She knows. God tells her. She tells the kids, God's going to tell me if you're lying or not, and He does. All right. My wife hears from God in a way that I rarely do. So, It's entirely possible that Delilah had that same lie detector and knew he was telling the truth.
My Bible said that it was 1,100 pieces of silver for each of the lords that approached her.
Mhm.
My Bible said there were 5 lords over the Philistines,
Okay.
so that would have been 5,500 pieces of silver.
Yeah. It's a lot of money.
I was just thinking his pride got in the way too, because it's kind of like he was giving her all these different scenarios, but then at the end he gives her the truth. Like maybe he was thinking he could, because sometimes when God gives us something, and we someone can get puffed up and then say, oh, maybe I can do this on my own.
Mhm.
So he forgot where his strength came from, because he was relying more on his own strength at that point, and then God. He didn't know that the Lord left him because he was kind of more focused on himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, he got up that last time. He charged right out saying, I'm going to do like I've done before. So, I think you're right. He had quite a bit of pride in himself.